To live with love is difficult. To live with hate is very easy. To live with judgment is very easy. To live with opinion is very easy. To live with love is difficult.
Welcome to a new episode of the Winnipeg Gems podcast, where we highlight the best and brightest in Winnipeg in real estate, business, and mental health. Today, we have Joel Kennedy. From the minute I met Joel, I could tell that I was in the presence of an amazing individual. This guy's depth of knowledge when it comes to relationships, when it comes to workplace, especially workplace safety, high-level contracts is unmatched. I've never met somebody that sees things exactly like this guy does. Enjoy. Joel, thank you so much for coming down. I've known you for quite a while, and I've found you to be like just one of the most interesting people I've met, not just in real estate, but just in general. So why don't you take a few minutes and just introduce yourself? Tell us what you do, what you're all about, and why you decided to come here today.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Joel Kennedy, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here, Dino. We've known each other probably, in excess of 5 to 7 years, probably more like 7 years now, and we've gotten some deep conversation, and so I'm here just to support mental health, bring some awareness to that, and talk a little bit about what I do, in my general life to support other people as well as myself with mental health. So, I work, I'm able to represent workers as a living. So, I'm able to get in and help negotiate quality of lives for many workers. It's a privilege to be able to kind of do that. So I found my way into that inadvertently in life. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think you're downplaying it a bit. I mean, I don't think you're getting across a scale to which you do that.
I'm humble. I've always been humble, and I think it's the way to kind of conduct yourself always, is come from a place of humble. But yeah, I work on an international level and as well on a national level in Canada. So I do get quite a swath of different people and get to experience many different cultures and diversities within the working groups that I represent.
Okay, so this is a good question to ask then. So you spend a lot of time traveling overseas, negotiating, helping, right? So how do you, I guess what I'm trying to ask is mental health different here versus other places? Or are we all the same, or are we facing different challenges?
I think at the end of the day, the struggles are the same. There's neurodivergencies that are out there. There's other struggles with mental health. I see a bit of a difference in North America. North America is a little very, very much capital driven. So there's a lot of different pressures that come with that, as opposed to maybe different second world countries or different, even European countries are staggered just a little bit differently, structured, sorry.
So how do you, do you want to just elaborate on that a bit? When you say structured differently, is it work-life balance? Is it just purely cultural things, or? And
you nailed it. I think it's a bit of both, and I do see in the European countries a little bit more work-life balance, which is not what I'm seeing here in North America. We have 24/7, 365, 7 days a week. People are working midnights, people are working afternoons, people are working 2 jobs. It's just the struggle to work as much as you possibly can to, keep your head above water these days.
Right. What effects have you seen on mental health as a result of overworking here?
Just the drive, the tolerances in your stress, the tolerances in your day-to-day life, the lack of the family balance, the lack of your connection to things like nature, your lack of connection to yourself. Really, you're working all the time. You don't have time to take care of yourself mentally and even physically as much as you should be, and that time's very, very important.
Now, I'm sure this goes, both ways depending on the situation, but do you think it's the employee that's choosing to do that? Is it the employer that's demanding it? Is it just the culture kind of forcing it to happen? Why is this happening?
Well, and you nailed it. Again, you nailed it. And it's no one-sided thing. It's the employee, the worker, trying to maximize, their ability to achieve money, right? At the end of the day, we work to achieve money, to increase our quality of life. But I also see the employers, running more overtime because it's cheaper than, training a new employee, right? You don't have to bring on and onboard new employees. You don't have to, have additional benefit packages. You don't have to bring those things when somebody could just work the overtime. So there's really no desire from employers to grow their workforce. There's more of a desire from employers to run on things like overtime because it's cheaper training. And, with the way that we've come to live in North America now, which is really dependent on credit, It's very difficult because people are now working more and more and more. They're more handcuffed to their employers to be able to get out of their debt, be able to, get out of these high inflationary times, to be able to get ahead.
So then from an employer standpoint, so let's pretend I'm an employer, okay? And my employees are working overtime. They're happy working overtime, or at least they tell me they are. At what point, how do I track or manage or help with their mental health? Because at some point there would be consequences, right?
Certainly. And a lot of employers and some of the bigger employers, they have things like in family assistance programs and certain things where employees can tap into to, find help when they're struggling with mental illness, mental health, or just struggling in general because of things like overworking or family problems. But I think that there's still a stigma attached to be able to reach out and ask for this kind of help. So I think that, in workplaces in general, there's still an issue with employees saying, hey, listen, I'm working too much, or you're working me too much, whether it's maybe a sign of weakness or, a threat, maybe that you're going to lose your job, you're not performing as much. I think that employers need to, build into their policies and build into their procedures, time, certain times and time allotments and framework to support its employees. So the employers recognizing some of these things and not putting that recognition so much on the employees.
Right. And I could see that, especially with what you mentioned earlier with, if I'm an employee, for example, and if I'm in a lot of debt and I'm working this overtime, trying to pay these things off and do all these things, I might be in fear of losing my job, like you said, if I try to have some of these concerns addressed. But at the same time, I think that same employee should probably realize that they are an asset to their employer, and that the employer would rather not, like you said, train a new employee. So is it? And it's probably both. But should the employers be doing more, or should the employees be standing up for themselves?
I think it's two-part, but I really do think that, given the high inflationary times we're in, given the struggle with credit, given the everyday struggle just to earn a decent income, I think that drives an employee to overlook their own health at a lot of the times, right? And I can speak for myself in that regard as well. But I will say, employers engaging their employees, making them aware, bringing awareness into the workplace, whether that be through posters, whether that be for conversations, whether, and additionally building it into policies and procedures as well. I think that there's a lot of an onus on an employer to bring that recognition into the workplace.
Yeah, more and more, I think, because we see things like iWatch stations, first aid kits in every workplace, defibrillators.
Certainly.
Right. So yeah, what would it cost to?
And that investment, an employer's investment in that regard is going to pay back, tenfold, right? Because they're going to have a healthier workforce. They're going to have recognition. Employees aren't going to wait until they're so sick or so stressed out that they're now on short-term disability for 6 or 8 months, or and they end up with prescriptions and other things. It's more of an awareness thing, a preventative type an approach with employees in the workplace.
Right. In your line of work, I'm sure you deal with people in all income brackets, right? When it comes to mental health in the workforce, do you see different struggles based on income level, or is it more of a wash?
I do believe that mental health is also associated with income. So I would have to agree that, with lower income, lower paid jobs, or even jobs that aren't superior or very great, that certainly does play an enhanced role in mental health. Absolutely.
Right. I guess what I'm really asking, though, is are they having the same struggles, or are they different based on what you've seen?
So based on what I've seen, they would be different struggles, right? So, mental health doesn't discriminate over wage brackets or earners or what your tax, how much tax you're paying. So let me get that straight. It's different problems associated, and I think you see a little bit of more struggle, when it comes to mental health and stress when you're in an environment not making as much or working more hours to try to make. So I think that, the struggles are different, and I don't think, quantity, they're any different. I think that they're just different struggles for the two different wage earners. You have somebody that's earning a different income. Maybe they're not thinking so much about the stress of their money. Maybe they're thinking about other stresses in their life, and other mental health issues are kind of coming in, where somebody who's in a lower income bracket is struggling with maybe some of those similar mental health issues, whether it be OCD, whether it be depression, whether it be anxiety, whatever it be. That doesn't discriminate.
Right.
But you will see other problems with lower income earners because they have different stressors that they're dealing with.
Got it. So you seem to know a lot about mental health. What personal experience do you have with mental health? Or have you been through struggles, or how come you know so much about this?
Most of my learning from mental health has come from just the passion that I've carried through my life. I've struggled with mental health, a lot of trauma from a very early age. A lot of violence in my household from a early age, and my mother having to leave to women's shelters, and other such things. So, I'm certainly not a stranger to mental health, and I've had my own struggles in life based on those traumas as a young man and a young child. And as I've grown into my role and I've come into the workplace, where I started in my career now, which wasn't planned at the time, was, I worked at a very large workplace, and it was a very volatile workplace. There was a lot of drinking. There was a culture of alcohol. There was a culture of, hey, listen, we're manly men. We got to be a certain way and act a certain way. And, I did see a lot of addiction in the workplace, and I saw a lot of suffering and a lot of mental health because of that. And so one of my first roles in the workplace was actually an employee family representative, where, somebody on the floor, the fellow worker could approach me and just have an open conversation about, hey, I'm struggling today, or, I'm having the problems with booze, or, I'm having problems with my relationship. And so that's, I've always been attached to mental health, whether it be exposed to myself for a period of time or trying to help others with mental health. So my whole career has always kind of been based around wanting to help with mental health. We've gotten some deep conversation, and so I'm here just to support mental health, bring some awareness to that, and talk a little bit about what I do, in my general life. I do, and in particular, I can talk about where I come from, and I see the dismantling of employee family programs, at big employers a lot of times because they cost, or they're coming from, a joint program where it's shared by worker representatives and company representatives sitting on a board to try to best address mental health in other places and support their workers. However, I'm seeing those types of joint boards and certain things being dismantled, and I'm seeing a lot of these services offloaded to third-party service providers who generally don't have a face. They just provide a service. They're just mostly brokers when it comes to mental health. And so, I do see a bit of a decline in that, but I also see a bit of an incline when it comes to the government and some of the government supports and some of the recognition out there in general when it comes to mental health.
Negotiating, helping.
The recognition to mental health is getting better, but I think the supports still need to come in place. There's still, when I'm negotiating contracts or when we're looking to enhance benefits, we have to expand into other sorts of counselors because, clinical psychologists really aren't available on the general days that people need help to be able to go in to see somebody. So, we're tapping into Canadian certified counselors. We're talking about social workers. We're talking about, bringing in a lot of different service providers into mental health because we don't have enough resource. The recognition is there, but the resources is not there yet. Differently structured, funding. When it comes into, you talk about the province of Manitoba respectfully, and I know everyone's doing the best, but you talk about somebody who wants to get into a treatment center, who's struggling with addiction, who's somebody who makes the decision in the moment, but can't get into a treatment center because the waiting lists are 2, 3, 4 months long. What happens is generally that person's lost again and, back into the system, back using again, because the immediate support's not there. And I think that's for addictions, that's for mental health, that's for a lot of different branches of mental health.
And I think you have a really good point there. It's the immediate help, because I know, especially when it comes to something like addiction, if a person has made the choice to get help, that's huge to begin with. And then if they're denied that help, then
they're not feeling heard, they're feeling suppressed, their feelings aren't validated, and generally it doesn't end up in a great situation. So somebody's back out on the street using, or somebody's back into a depression, back maybe self-harming, doing certain things that they maybe reached out for help. But that support needs to be immediate, and it needs to be quality. And we're not seeing that now.
Yeah, there's not enough of it. Even I've spent time in a psych ward twice, and it was, how do I put it? It was more normal than people think. It was just a wing in the hospital where people with mental health problems were staying for a bit. And it was full all the time. I was lucky to get in when I did. And if I didn't, I think there was maybe one other hospital that had a couple of rooms, I heard, but that was it.
And that's the problem, and we live in Winnipeg, and I'll tell you that we're a beautiful, beautiful society here in Winnipeg, but we're a blue-collar society. We're not sitting on, mounds and mounds and mounds of cash. And yeah, if you have $15,000 cash available to you right now, you can get into a treatment center very quickly. But listen, people that are coming from addiction, generally don't have $15,000 kicking around. They're depending on the province, and the province needs to be able to supply these resources as medical supports, right? This they have now with dentistry, the federal government. Mental health addiction, there needs to be more, and not more private resource, more publicly funded, publicly oversighted resources for us to tap into.
Right. because we have some great volunteer organizations, obviously like the Mood Disorders Association. They're fantastic, but I think they're mostly run by volunteers. And I think you nailed it with your other point where you said you need immediate help, but it has to be quality help too. Not saying that the volunteers aren't quality help, but when it comes to things like acute care and like immediate intake, immediate like strong 24-hour support, the people that are providing that support, well, they need to be qualified, they need to be trained, and they need to be paid.
Certainly.
Right?
You need the right people in the right positions to be able to do their jobs properly and give the right supports, the right compassion, right? It's not something that you can just show up when you're dealing with health and medical distress and mental health. This is not something where you punch a card and you do 8 hours and you're out. It takes a special person to be able to do that kind of work day in and day out and have that level of compassion and care with them as well. So, and I will talk about women's shelters. It's another immediate support that, totally underfunded. Women's shelters in the city are constantly looking for funding, volunteers to come patch holes in the walls, put up shelves, do things, because there's just no funding for these critically essential supports that we need. When, and I can speak to this, I was a child, we had to tap into the same services. And I can remember quite well, but when, a single mother or a mother that's a product of the domestic assaults or abuse needs to get out of a situation, they need to be supported quickly, and they need to be able to come into a place that, gives them the essentials that they need to have. Otherwise, they're not going to stay into a service place, and they're going to get back, where they feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And it's usually not a great situation.
One thing you said that just stuck out to me and probably stick with you for a long time. Like, I've never seen the inside of a women's shelter. I probably will now. But I haven't. And when you said patch holes and put shelves up, like that form of volunteering never even, like, I never would have even thought of that.
Yeah.
But it makes total sense. If you're going to a place where you're supposed to receive care that's supposed to help you, it's supposed to be better, but there's holes in the walls and there's things missing and there's damage and what appears to be neglect, it doesn't resonate the way it should.
Exactly, especially coming out of a situation where you've come from, right, generally, which is probably not good. But certainly there's a lot that needs to be done there. This is not dollars. The dollars keep things going, it keeps food coming in. But the general maintenance, the upkeep, the programming for the kids, the toys, there's just so much out there. And the other part of this is that everyone's competing for funding. So, in this city, it's incredible. And I was part of an organization a few years back, which I thought was brilliant. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to volunteer with them anymore. But essentially what this was a steering committee of mental health organizations, right? Because what the steering committee recognized was that we're all fighting for the same thing, but we're all competing for funding.
Yeah.
So we have so many different beautiful groups out here that are doing so many different beautiful things, and to contribute to mental health and to support mental health, but we're all fighting against each other for funding. So part of what needs to happen is we all need to come together as well, and bring all these different organizations together and come together for the one purpose, which is human rights and mental health and support.
So that's a really cool way to look at it. So what would the way that you're imagining this, what would be the equivalent in the health industry right now? Is there an equivalent?
I'm not sure. I think that there probably would be in the health industry here in Manitoba, that you would have a board of professionals that would be kind of steering our medical system here. You would have that same type of board. Now, who's comprised? I'm not sure of what that looks like, and if it's just a mixture of very, very professional medical professionals, or if it's a mixture of stakeholders and various stakeholders that come from different geographics and demographics and different diversities that can contribute to what is actually needed out there.
Yeah, and it's tricky, I guess, because if I'm a donor, let's say, and actually I just listened to this in it was a book that I was reading. It was called Made to Stick. Talk about sticky ideas and persuasion and things like that. So it talked about donating to I think it was something to do with Africa. All right, and then it talked about they had two groups of participants, and one group was asked to make a donation to an organization, and then one group was asked to sponsor a child. And the group that was sponsoring the child, on average, donated about, I think it was triple or quadruple. So it's like I love the idea of like this big umbrella kind of support for mental health organizations, or kind of them kind of joining forces, combining. But how do you as a donor, am I more likely to donate to the cause that I most strongly believe in and want to support, like a women's shelter or the mood disorders or whatever? Or would I be more prone to giving funding to kind of a more ambiguous umbrella?
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that would be the challenge because you do have the individuals that are very strong about, say, women advocacy, right? Whether it's women advocacy, whether it's neurodivergence, whether it be depression, whether it be anxiety, the people do also like to contribute to that certain thing. So so the umbrella, it is a really good idea because what that does is it draws in all the funding where people aren't competing against each other. But I guess where that takes away is the autonomy of the individual, wanting to contribute to certain places. However, that's going to be something that can be overfunded or overcome through just the structure of certain organizations and how it's done.
And I guess when you think about, good example. Okay, so cigarettes, they used to be able to advertise however they wanted, wherever they wanted, right? And then somebody stepped in and said, you guys can't do that anymore. And they all complained, all the brands, but they were also all kind of laughing because advertising was, I hear, something like 30% of their budget. So I guess maybe a part of it would be now, instead of competing for all this funding, because they use funding dollars to try and get more funding dollars, right? So if that was all taken away, then maybe there would be a way to kind of...
And some more government oversight, would probably help with that as well, right? So government can come in and oversight and start taking control of some of this stuff as well. And that's what really needs to happen.
Yeah. So, like, aside from my own personal experiences with mental health, like a big reason why I wanted to do this as well is Winnipeg seems to be it's a growing mental health crisis. There's no denying it, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, COVID wasn't nice to people. It's kind of sped that up a bit, sure. But it's when I notice it most when I have clients come in from other cities, other countries, and they take a drive down Main Street and they go, what's happening? And it's hard to explain that in a short time frame. You know what I mean? You have to go back quite a bit to make them fully understand. And a lot of them, they're not from here. They're not really interested in a long explanation. So I'm interested to hear, like, if you had to explain it in like 2 sentences, 3 sentences, what do you think is the problem?
And I would probably sum it up in just a couple of words. When I would have to say that's trauma. And I would have to say that's poverty. When we look at the trauma and we look at some of the things that have happened in the past that we're dealing with right now when it comes to truth and reconciliation, when we talk about the prairies and some of the isolation in the prairies as well, and when I talk about Winnipeg, I can kind of talk about the prairies at the same time because, when we get into Regina, when we get into Edmonton, we're starting to see a lot of similarities. But, I'll draw it back to trauma. And I'll bring it back to isolation, and and I don't want to say poverty because we're not impoverished. However, the prairies are more blue collar, the wages don't seem to be there, and we're more isolated, seasonally and geographically in the prairies as well, which also has contributed to certain things as well.
Yeah. So when you say trauma, if you had to expand on that a bit, like.
So when I speak about trauma, I speak about, the things that have happened in the past when we talk about residential schools, when we talk about the 60s scoop, when we talk about a lot of the trauma that we saw happen, years and years past, it's just manifested because, we failed to deal with truth and reconciliation for a very long time, and it's just starting to happen now. And I think that with truth and reconciliation on the forefront, some of these traumas can start to be healed. Now, the traumas, that have happened in the past, a lot of the traumas that we see in the prairies, there's not a lot of healing that have come from that. So, you bring that in with isolation, you bring that in with, impoverished wages, in the kind of our blue-collar kind of community. I think that's what we see happening in the prairies today, and in particular in Winnipeg as well.
So what's the solution, if there is one?
Transparency, openness, talking about it, resources, and funding for resources. The province has a lot of work to do. The government of Canada has a lot of work to do when it comes to resources and funding for resources here in the prairies, and in particular all in Canada. But the prairies, we do have a very specific problem.
So what we're experiencing here in Winnipeg, you're kind of seeing like across the across Saskatchewan and Alberta as well?
I see it in Saskatchewan, certainly, in pockets in Alberta as well, and mostly up in northern Alberta. However, I don't see it as much, as we get into, Toronto East, kind of. It's something in the prairies, northern Ontario. And again, that's a lot of the isolation as well. We're very vast and open, and our communities are very far apart in the prairies in northern Ontario.
So you mentioned having firsthand experience with women's shelters, right? So how did you get from there to where you are right now?
That's a bit of a journey. That's a bit of a journey in itself. And I'll bring it back as a young man, probably about 3-4 years old. Again, going back, there was a lot of violence in my household, and which triggered my mom to leave my father with, 4 kids in tow, 2 in diapers, and myself with 4, my sister was 5. And so, that in itself, started to mold me as an individual at a very young age. And so, I kept that close to me for many years, and it was a significant part of my journey. But I will tell you that a lot of the trauma that I suffered as a young man, which led us going to the women's shelter, and even being at the women's shelter, safety and security type issues manifested into drinking and other things as a teenager, and so I started to see some of those problems when I was a teenager. As I started growing up and getting into my early 20s, I recognized that, the drinking wasn't something that I was happy with, and it was something that I experienced as a young man, and something that I saw that brought a lot of trauma into my household. So, I made a decision at a young age to try to take myself out of that, and I left a relationship that was very toxic, which ended up creating more trauma for myself with the breakup and everything. So I stumbled for a few years after that, and I was able to pick myself up, and I stopped drinking, and I started just really working on myself personally.
So when you say working on yourself, like, what did that look like for you?
That was, for many years, and I think it was because of the trauma I experienced as a young man, was I had no self-esteem, I had no self-love, I was, just very low. I didn't really have a high picture of myself. And so I started to, I didn't want to medicate myself. I just, with prescription medication. So I actually went and started dealing with traditional type medicines, and ended up having a friend who introduced me to a sweat lodge ceremony. And I started going through sweat lodge ceremonies, and then, that transpired into meeting other people and medicine men, and going into other forms of traditional healing. Which really helped me deal with some of the past trauma that I had. And once I was able to deal with that past trauma and start loving myself again and healing from that trauma, was when my life really took a bit of a change, and I really started changing as an individual and as a person, is when I started to love myself again.
So then how long ago was that? Like, I'm trying to...
So in time frame, that was probably only... I think I met you about 7 years ago, so that would have been, 8 or 9 years ago as I really started that journey. So up until about 8 or 9 years ago, I really struggled with self-worth and self-love and self-esteem, and, I always wanted to be somebody else, and never really was, wanted to be myself, and I never really had looked in the mirror through my whole entire life and said, I love you, I love that person I'm staring at, And in fact, it was the opposite through most of my life. I didn't really like that person, but, through the healing work that I've done, which was very earth-based, I was able to unfold a lot of that trauma, and I think I was about 35 when it was the first time in my life I was actually able to look in the mirror and say, I love you. And that was a significant moment. I still remember it today, and that's when my healing as a person really, really began, and my life really started changing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, what's a sweat lodge ceremony, and what are the other things that you did?
So the sweat lodge ceremony is it's a ceremony from our Indigenous cultures here in Canada, and it's very spiritual based, and but it represents rebirth, and it represents many different things, but it's really essential to healing and rebirth. So as I started understanding that, and started working with elders, and started, telling my story, and started receiving teachings and understandings. And really that opened my eyes up to a whole other world of healing and knowledge and spiritual beliefs that I'd never understood or known before. And that spoke to me, that resonated with me more than a medical system, more than anything ever has ever spoken to me. And so I continued that journey, and it just expanded into learning other ceremonies, learning other traditional types of medicine, and learning some other cultures, and just understanding what else was out there rather than prescription medication, which is also very good and very powerful. But for me, just to explore other alternative forms of healing and medications, and which led me to finding a friend who was practicing with ayahuasca for a number of years, and I started going through ayahuasca ceremonies, and those were very profound. And it was through those ceremonies where the trauma really started unwinding itself through my body, and I started really learning about myself and the traumas that I've been through, and really starting to heal from that. So that was profound when I started entering those ceremonies, and I will tell you that the healing that's taken place with traditional medicine has been extraordinary.
Like you said, like there's a lot of good in prescription medications, but I don't know. I'm of the belief that they're more for acute care. Like if you need something to stop, like fast, like for me, like I definitely benefited from prescription meds, but they tend to have side effects.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
And I'm really happy that you found a way to to heal, and like things to help with that don't seem to have side effects other than positive things.
Yeah, and it's ongoing, right? It's when we get into the Eastern medicine, I guess there's certainly a balance to be struck, and incredible advancements in Eastern medicine or Western medicine. But we talk about Eastern medicine, we also, I think, have forgotten about some of that Eastern medicine. And Eastern medicine is a way of living and understanding, and which helps with mental health as well, if that makes sense. So I agree when it comes to acute care, but I also believe that there's ongoing care that needs to take place to put yourself in a good mental state as well, and understand some of the things and have faith in way the world's going and certain other things.
Yeah, I think it's the healthcare system versus the sick care system.
Yeah,
East and West, that seems to be what it is, and
it certainly is. Yeah,
like here we seem to separate mental health from health. We don't even have a word for the other health.
Yeah.
Whereas everywhere else, it's like you're well or you're not.
A lot of what we see in the Eastern type medicines is the ongoing care, right? Is going in for you having the ceremonies, and a lot of it is earth based, right? Understanding the moon cycles and honoring the moon, and understanding the spirits of the animals, and just being in tune with nature, and understanding what nature is also teaching you. And I think that we've been cut off from that a little bit as a society. We're in concrete walls a lot. We're not out in the forest a lot. We're not understanding, some of the medicines that are even out there, or some of the different frequencies and vibrations you can even get from, being in different environments, and how that affects your body. Community. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously you've had your struggles, and I know personally the struggle never fully goes away, right? And being in the high stress position that you're in, being kind of all over the world, doing all the things you do, how do you cope these days?
I cope with many different things, but I think one of my best things that I use, and the best tools that I have, number one, is to take control, to take away control. So when I talk about ego, judgment, opinion, certain things like that, I try to remove all that stuff, and I try just to show love all the time, which I think is lacking in this world. Everyone's got an opinion, everyone's got a judgment, everyone's got ego driven, everyone's got a selfish desire, and I think that's fueling a lot of the problems that we see today. And I think truly once you can shed those things and live in a place of love, and understanding, and just have faith, and start taking away your control, I think is very helpful. And that takes a constant daily ongoing initiative to be able to do that. Every single day. To live with love is difficult. To live with hate is very easy. To live with judgment is very easy. To live with opinion is very easy. To live with love is difficult. To love somebody you hate is very difficult. To love somebody that's done something wrong to you is very difficult. To understand why somebody's done something and to love them for it is difficult. And that's where the world needs to get to today. So some of the things that I do to help keep it real is I really love to help people. I really love to talk openly about my story. I love to talk about the struggles that I've had. We've touched on just a few of them here. That helps me because I think it doesn't show that we're not all immune to these things, right? That we all have these struggles. So I think that sharing my story helps other people. I still like to go into women's shelters today and volunteer, and it helps me. It helps me come back down to this is where I came from. This is where a lot of things started for me. And just to give that love and that compassion and go and see the kids, and it attaches me back to when I was a kid in those. So, as much as I'm helping others, it really is helping heal me myself as well at the same time, and it fills me up. So just being out there and loving and helping and giving back and caring to all those underfunded places that we talked about, or those, lifting up those stones just to make sure, is somebody okay, and, taking the time out on the street to somebody who's looking for money or asks you for a cigarette to just talk with them for a while. Like, just be, you don't give them money or a cigarette, but just give them time, give them your love, give them your time, and I think that's the significant part of just healing and the ongoing care is just living in a certain way. Removing the egos and the judgments it's all poison, and it poisons us. But, we grow up in this way and our thinking's about that. But once we can start changing our thinking just a little bit and shifting that to a more of a selfless, a place of selflessness and love, I think that, that's been a significant piece for me. And what also happens is the universe starts paying that back. You live in a certain way. You talk in a certain way, and you love people in a certain way, and that all comes back to you. That negative, if you live in the negative world, that all comes back to you. And so a lot of people that, are going through a lot of the traumas are not living in a certain way, and they're wondering, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why does this keep happening to me? I got bad luck. Well, bad luck is preparation meets opportunity. So, it's not about luck. It's about living in a certain way and having those energies coming back to you. And it will come back to you.
And I agree. I think luck, good or bad, is something that happens once.
That's right.
Right? If it keeps happening, then it's not luck anymore.
That's right. And just start looking at yourself.
Yeah. As a father, obviously, aside from providing a lovely home and care, love, and everything else, how do you talk to your kids about mental health? How do you make sure that they don't have same or similar traumas in their life?
It's difficult because you can talk to a kid and talk to a kid, and sometimes kids need to go out there and learn things on their own, and that can be difficult as a parent watching. But I think just being open with your children, talking with your children, transparency is a big deal, right? Trust, right? Just being open and being honest and candid with your kids, and just, and that's something that I didn't grow up with. And I think that I struggled for a long time is, hey, listen, you're a man, you don't cry, you don't talk about stuff, and, suck it up, you got to be tough, you got to do all these things. Well, you don't. And a lot of those things actually come back and hurt you.
I think so, because I think that's one of those, it's one of those traits that we would, as we evolve, lose traits, right? And I think, there was a time, thousands of years ago, where men needed to be a certain way for certain reasons. And maybe there was some validity to not showing weakness and all this stuff. But I don't think, we're not huddled in tribes trying to kill each other anymore. like we're past that, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's something we could probably do away with. And
a lot of it's misguided masculinity, right? And we're plagued with that. And I'll tell you, I had blonde hair and blue eyes growing up, and I certainly wasn't privileged. But I've come to understand I was privileged, right? But with that, privilege, I guess if that's the word you want to use, is I was expected to act in certain ways and to do certain things and to be cool, and this is what you need to do to be a man, and you need to fight people, and you need to hurt people, you need to be strong, and I tell you, I was all those things, and all those things hurt me. At the end of the day, I'd be at a party and I'd beat somebody up, and my buddies would be like, "Oh, that's super cool, you're tough," and I'd feel that recognition in the moment. But when I was home alone by myself, I'll tell you, I'd cry because I hurt somebody, and that wasn't me. But that's when the addiction starts, and that's when stuffing down your feelings start, and that's when the problems start, right? You're not yourself. You're doing these things. You're hurting people, and you're hurting yourself at the same time. And, to get through that hurt, you're stuffing it down with other things. Maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's other things. It could be a wealth of different things, and not even substance. But I think that, once we realize that we don't have to be a certain way, and once we realize that, society is not totally right, and we can be free to be ourselves, we don't have to have these handcuffs on, and, I don't have to be the toughest guy in the room. I don't have to be wearing Nike shoes. I don't have to be wearing Adidas. I don't have to be wearing, and that's all things that, are superficial, but all these things that are attached to ego, opinions, judgment, that's where I talk about once we're free from all those things as a society, once we're free as a person, you can really start growing and really start loving. And a lot of these traumas that you do feel, kind of start healing themselves in you, because a lot of the stuff we're just shoving down because we're not doing what we should be doing as human beings. Right. We're actually doing a lot different things that we should be doing.
Right. And that's a really, really good point too. And I think a lot of it comes down to mindset. And it's like, you're I feel like we're always going in a direction. It's either the right one or the wrong one, right? So if you're going in the right direction, you're doing the right things. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what they all are, but deep down, I think you know.
Yep.
Right. And then it's the same with the other way. And I think most people can tell which way they're headed.
Yeah. Yeah. A good example of some of these opinions and certain other things is, on Christmas time, generally what I'll go out and I'll bring my kids and I'll go to, a place like the Thunderbird house in Winnipeg on Higgins and Main, which, a lot of people drive by and they think, oh my God, it's a very scary place. And, but they don't understand the traumas and everything else that have created that environment around that. They think a certain thing. And, but I will tell you, that I do go down there on Christmas and I bring money with me. I bring cash. And, I don't bring tins of food and I don't bring blankets and I don't do that. And, the comments that I get from people, not that I advertise what I do because I don't believe in that, is, how come you're bringing the money? They're just going to spend it on drugs or alcohol. But that's not on us. I'm there donating. I'm there being a good person. I'm giving them support. What they spend money on, is not up to me to decide, right? I'm not a dictator. I'm not saying, hey, listen, you need this can of corn today. No, here's some money. Maybe you're going to go buy some food. Maybe you're going to go buy a present for the child you haven't seen for a long time. Yeah. Maybe you're going to go buy some crack cocaine. I don't know. Right. But I'm here supporting you without condition.
Right.
And that's, I think, the word, which is very significant, was, unconditional love. Right, without condition. I can love you for who you are, whether you're a drug addict, whether you're a gay man, whether you're neurodivergent, whether you are autistic, whether you're, bipolar. I love you. And that's where we need to get to as a society. And I think that's the most significant word, is unconditional love.
When it comes down to love, so I've read a lot of books, and I mostly started reading very heavily once I got into my career, just because I wanted to, learn, grow, do better very quickly. And I think books are the best way to do that. Podcasts are great, which is why I'm doing one, obviously. But I feel like when you watch a podcast, you get a lot of insight. But when you read a book, you kind of see the same topics over and over and over again. It really kind of sinks in, right? So a book that I read was called The Greatest Salesman in the World. And it was a book that was about this thick,
okay,
but it took a year to read.
Okay.
Because there were 10 lessons in there, 10 scrolls. And the idea was you had to read each scroll 3 times a day. So 3 times a day. I think one of them was out loud as well. So at night it was out loud. So in the morning, afternoon, and at night out loud before you went to bed. And the second scroll was called I Will Greet This Day with Love in My Heart. And it just talked about like exactly what you're talking about. Not so much from the perspective of, somebody that's having a hard time, but just everybody in general, like everybody you meet. Because like I said, we have a choice. You come to meet somebody, and if you decide that you love this person before you open your mouth to say anything, whatever you say next is going to come out a lot better.
Yeah.
Whatever you feel is going to come out a lot better. You can change your mind later. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you can start off loving somebody, decide, I don't like you anymore. That's fine. But if you approach somebody with the thought that you don't like them or that you hate them, then where's that conversation going to go?
That's right.
So that's something I really tried to internalize, and I think you nailed it with the unconditional aspect, because we see all these people doing nice things and then posing for photos with the people and whatever. And it's like, I get that you might want to, I'm doing this podcast in support of the Mood Disorders Association of Manitoba. I say that all the time. I'll say it all day. But I think it's a little different when you're giving somebody something that really needs it and then posing, and it's not unconditional at that point.
You're right.
It's different. There's hey, great on you. That's amazing. but are you doing it to, to help this person, or are you doing it to look like a good person?
And listen, and I see it all the time, and you're right, and that's where the selflessness comes from. And listen, the creator, the universe, whatever you want to define, we'll take care of that in the end. But it's really unfortunate because this stuff needs to come from a selfless place, and I'm privileged enough to be in the role that I do have in my professional life, and I do see corporations just signing on to and cutting checks just so they can get a picture and a photo op, and just so they can define themselves as, hey, listen, we support this, we can support that, and set themselves aside, and they say that they can do certain things, and so I don't really agree with that. I mean, I'm happy to take the funding, and happy that the funding's there because these organizations and these groups absolutely need it, but it would be nice to see people living in this way, not just taking a picture and cutting a check. People need to live in a certain way, right? And I think that's where I'm most grateful, because at one time I thought everything that happened to me in my life, including the violence and the addiction and just everything that I've seen, the struggle, the trauma, and I used to it used to affect my self-esteem, and I used to think it was lesser than. But as I've come to understand it now, it's made me who I am today, and I'm happy I went through those struggles, because now I understand and I can help people from a very real place. I know how they feel. I know what substance feels like, tastes like. I know what feeling scared feels like. I know what trauma feels like. I know what security and not having security as a young child feels like. Yeah. I can resonate that. I know what that kind of stuff manifests into. And it gives me a real perspective on how I can walk through this earth. When you talk about waking up, and I can resonate with that comment is, and I didn't know why I prayed like this for a long time, but I would wake up in the mornings and with a sense of gratitude, and every day I'm happy and I'm thankful for all the trauma that I went through, which is something that is new for me. I used to be scared of it and run from it, but I'm thankful, and it makes me humble and brings me humility, and I'm glad I went through it all. It gives me the ability to be able to understand and help people from a real live perspective, right? Not from up on a perch somewhere, but a lived true experience. And I wake up every day with that sense of gratitude, and I say it every day, and I also pray that the Lord, the Creator, whoever you look at the divine is, and it doesn't really matter. For myself, it's Creator. Is to try to make the best person for myself, but not for myself, for everybody else. Right. So for people that I run into that day, to make sure that my capacity, that I have room in my capacity for other people, right? So the person on the street that maybe needs to talk for a while, that everybody else just walks by, right. I'll stop for that person and I'll talk and I'll take on that negativity and I'll take that on, I'll take it in, But I asked for the Creator to give me that every day, that space that I can take that, and I'm thankful for that, to make the best person for myself, the best person, for Dino, for the best person for my employers, for the people that I represent, for the best person I can for everybody else except for myself, and that's what I pray for every single day. And I think that's where we need to get through is, just love and get out of ourselves.
Yeah, if everybody was like that, I couldn't even imagine. That'd be pretty great. It would be a good world.
Take a day off.
It would be a good world. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can resonate a lot with that too. Like, a big reason why I'm even doing this in the first place is because of what happened to me. And what happened to me was a very, very common thing. 1 in 100 people have this, right? And the biggest thing that frustrated me with the whole experience was that it took me, 3, 4, 5 months of me losing my mind, losing everything I had, for somebody to finally tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, have you thought about getting some help? And my friends and family are educated people, they're smart people, they're caring people, compassionate people, and nobody knew what was going on. So that's the biggest thing that bugged me. It's like, it's 1 in 100 is pretty common.
Yeah, it is.
I went to high school with 1,200 kids. So that means 12 people in there would have the same thing.
Yeah.
So why? And it's not me pitying myself or the situation or anything. I'm just saying, like, this should not happen to the next person.
Yeah.
So if somebody close to me, if I start seeing kind of the same similar symptoms, we'll call them. I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose them. I can help them to a degree, but I can at least, tap them on the shoulder and maybe cut them off at the 2-month mark, not the 5 or 6 or 7 or a year or 10 years or however long it goes. So no, I could definitely resonate with a lot of that. And it's, I'm also grateful for what happened to me, because it puts me in a position now of understanding first and foremost, not just of, what's going on with me and what happened to me, but similar issues. And like we said earlier, like somebody is well or they're not. And if I can sense that somebody is not well, I will try to help that person become well. And it's usually through connections. Like I said, I actually tried volunteering for a mental health organization in the past, and it just didn't coincide with my schedule. I just couldn't devote the regular time that it took to do that. So that's a big reason why I started this podcast. I was like, hey, I can't give them the time they need, but I'll raise awareness instead. And in a similar capacity, if somebody I think needs help, I at least know where to send them. And I can't force anybody to do anything, but I can, I tell them, hey, this is who you should call. This is what you should do. And then I'll check up. Like, hey, did you call this person? Did you do that?
Yeah.
Hey, why not? Just like gentle nudges, right? Because he and I both know, like, you can't force anybody to do anything. If they're not ready to accept the help, then
that's right. But that's a love and compassion, right? And that's taking away your ego, being able to remove yourself and go down and talk to somebody that's, hey, listen, I can see you're struggling, or hey, listen, you showed up to work today and you smell like alcohol, or hey, you're coming to school today and you're just not yourself. You're reclused. A lot of people will just say, listen, point fingers and say, hey, listen, that person reeks like alcohol. They got a problem, or they're just whatever. But to understand why, to not operate in a level of ignorance, but in a decent compassion and a decent human being to say, hey, listen, what's going on? Because listen, you don't know what's going on. And that's a problem. There's a reason today. Maybe that person doesn't just like drinking alcohol because they like just to waste their life. Maybe they're struggling with something. They're shoving something down. And listen, maybe by you tapping them on the shoulder and saying, hey, brother, I love you. What's going on with you today? Yeah. Maybe you could save one life by doing something like that. And that's where we need to get back to. When we talk about love and that compassion and removing your ego and opinions and judgments, remove all that stuff. Yeah. One human to another human. What's going on? You don't look good today. Can I help you? Can I talk to you? Maybe that person just needs to be talked to and acknowledged.
So, acknowledgement, huge.
Which is totally huge. Yeah. So, and that's, again, going back to why I am so thankful. And again, I used to be, embarrassed of the trauma that I went through, right? Like saying I went to a women's shelter, or, hey, listen, I had a drinking problem, or I thought I had a drinking problem, or I struggled with addiction, or, I embraced all that trauma now. Because it makes me real again, and it puts me into a place of humility.
Yep.
And I walked into Main Street Projects at 23 years old, and I had kids young, right? I had kids at 18, and I was a dedicated father. And one night, because I was young, we stayed up drinking one night with our friends, and and I wasn't comfortable with that because of going back to my childhood trauma, listening to alcohol, parties, and that being scared as an infant and as a kid, and I wasn't happy about that. And my partner looked at me like I was crazy, but I said, listen, like, this is not the kind of life I want. I don't want to be drinking and stuff. Like, so I didn't even have a problem at the time, but, I removed myself from that problem and went to Main Street Projects. I said, I didn't want to be part of that drinking. I wanted to make sure that I was not getting, or creating the same situation that I was exposed to as a child, which was awful. And, so I went away, and put myself into a treatment center at that time. Even looking back, I probably didn't need it, but I just needed an intervention.
Right, you needed to change.
I just needed to get out of that rut that my partner and I were kind of getting into, and my partner didn't want to get out of that rut. I did, and it was that was the best thing I ever did. Is walking into Main Street Projects in Winnipeg, and you want to talk about humility, right? Is walking into there for 10 days and staying in there and being locked in there and going through that, but it provided me with humility and many different things. And it was probably one of the best experiences in my life when I look back on it now. And, going back into Winnipeg services and mood orders of Manitoba, mood disorders of Manitoba, and the Main Street Projects and others, these are significant organizations that play such a vital role in our community. To bring light to it and bring the supports, and immediate supports as well.
So the key thing with organizations like that, and it's a mood disorders tagline, helping people help themselves, right? Because it's not enough to just be, spoon-fed some, we'll call it help, and then sent on your way. That's right. But it's, giving them the tools and the knowledge and the resources to actually continue to help themselves once they're out of there.
That's right. With the follow-up, with the care, with the compassion that you talked about.
Yeah. But so for now, okay, Joel, man.
Yeah,
thank
man.
you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Awesome talk.
I appreciate it.